And Geoff's broad research areas include climate change policy, environmental economics, income and wealth distribution, and small island economies. And over the years, he's published lots of papers and made lots of presentations over all these areas. Now, focusing on what ESR is currently more involved in, regarding the serious problems we have with how our electricity market works, Geoff made a Zoom presentation to ESR in August 2020, and he's also been involved in quite a number of articles, presentations, and submissions related to our electricity market issues. And tonight, Geoff's presentation relates to climate change, the perspective on New Zealand's climate change policies. This is an area in which Geoff has been particularly active in recent years. He co-authored a book about our emissions trading scheme back in 2010, and he has put together quite a lot of articles, affidavits, presentations, and submissions in this area. In particular, he understands better than most of us how the government and the Climate Change Commission are making our weak response to climate change even harder for the public to assess with their, quote, target accounting, unquote, approach to expressing New Zealand's net emissions. So, Geoff, great to have you here tonight.
Okay.
Thanks.
Well, I think that's a wonderful introduction. And from that, I think, Geoff, we can get on with what we can learn from you.
If anything.
Thanks.
Engineers are supposed to know this stuff.
Incidentally, are you using AI? I asked my AI, my Bing co-pilot, what can you tell me about the New Zealand scientist Geoff Bertram, and it came back with a fantastic amount.
Oh,
so everything pretty well that Peter just summarised, all with links too, links to papers and all sorts.
Oh well, I'm suitably frightened at the thought that all of that material is available to the security services. I guess I better get on with what I'm doing tonight. Peter has suggested to me that it's hard to understand the accounts that the government uses to talk about climate change policy. So I thought I'd do two things tonight. One of them is to talk about measurement of emissions and how government policy is framed around that. And secondly, to come on to what seems to me a really fascinating conundrum that's been produced last week in the second emission reductions plan, which the government has produced as an alternative to actually reducing any emissions. And the cover story that they are running for the emissions reduction plan involves some very, very bold economic propositions. So I just wanted to, in the last part of what I do tonight, bring you up to speed with some stuff that I'm about to write in submissions on the new emission reduction plan. The data I'm going to show you comes from the last 3 years, and there are four basic sources I think you'll see as we go through. One of them is the greenhouse gas inventory that New Zealand submits to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change every year. Another one is the Ministry for the Environment's projections of gross and target net emissions. The third one is the 8th National Communication that New Zealand put in to the UNFCCC in December 2022. And the last one is the emission reduction plan itself that came out last week with a technical annex in which presented some modelling work. And the technical modelling material that I have is not on the public record yet because the modelling team hasn't actually put their modelling work in their database up. But I do have two of the key series that they've used, which I'll be presenting in the stuff I do tonight. So we'll start with, this is the latest inventory report published in April of 2024 of New Zealand's emissions in the year 2022, which is the last year for which we have data. And you can see in the million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent is the scale, which runs from -30 across to positive 90. These are 1,000,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. So the various greenhouse gases are converted into a single equivalence metric. There's obviously some alchemy involved in that, but all the numbers that I use tonight are what are called AR5, which means that they're done in the format that the IPCC now uses to convert gases, which is called AR5, but we've moved on from AR4 over the last 3 or 4 years. AR4 is now an obsolete accounting arrangement. So what we've got, you can see that agriculture is the dominant component. That's methane and nitrous oxide. Energy is the second most important component. Industry and waste are relatively minor over at the right-hand side. And then there's this big one over at the left, land use change and forestry, which is trees absorbing carbon dioxide. And in future, it may be that we add another category out there for carbon sequestration and storage, because there are proposals underway to try to do carbon capture and storage. So the gross emissions from agriculture, energy, industry, waste, and a little tiny wee bit from Tokelau are 78.4 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. The absorption of carbon by forests is 19.2 metric tonnes, which means that the net emissions, as we understand them in the scientific meaning of net emissions, are 59.2 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's the sort of quantitative framework to have in your mind around which climate change policy is being developed. And so there are 3 measures of emissions, and this is the one that I just showed you. This the first one I showed you, gross emissions. That's all the positive emissions from 0 up to 79.5 or 78, rather. Sorry. So that's the gross emissions from the New Zealand economy. These are the net emissions, which is the gross emissions minus what the forests have absorbed. And the thing you notice about this, which is really the most important thing to remember in all discussions of New Zealand climate policy, is those 2 series move pretty much in parallel. In other words, if gross emissions are going up, so are net emissions going up. The amount of forestry absorption between those 2 lines has not changed that much over the period since 1990. And that's a fundamental, this is what the atmosphere sees, this net emissions line. That is the actual change in the composition of the atmosphere attributable to New Zealand's emissions and absorption of carbon. So any policy evaluation has to confront the task of bringing net emissions down. When the IPCC in 2018 did a special report on reaching 1.5 degrees Celsius, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, all of their modelling is in terms of bringing down the curve of net emissions, this dotted one here. And what you can see is that actually, because in the last decade or so, our gross emissions have flattened off, which is good. Our net emissions have equally sort of flattened off. And in the very last few years, there is a downturn, which is a worldwide phenomenon. The whole world is indeed becoming more efficient in its use of energy and so on, and producing less emissions. The trouble is that we have to do it a heck of a lot faster than it has been happening in order to get anywhere near the sort of Paris Agreement targets of 2 degrees or 1.5. So those are the 2 measures that really matter. And now here comes the one that the policymakers use all the time. And this one is called target accounted net emissions. And you can see the target accounted net emissions, this dotted line across here, has been pretty well flat ever since 1990. There's an exciting little bit here, because in the period around about 2004 to 2007, the Central North Island went through a massive process of deforestation to expand dairy farming up in the Reparawa Taupo area. And so there's a big bulge of forests that had actually been, many of which have been planted back here, actually getting chopped down just before 2008. And then lo and behold, 2008, all that stops with a screaming halt. And you can, if you read this with a little bit of history in your mind, 2008 was the first year of the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, to which New Zealand signed up and where we took a binding commitment. And it is not coincidental that coming into the Kyoto Protocol first commitment period, a large number of players in the economy made very sure they'd finished the deforesting they wanted to do before we came into Kyoto. Okay, so there's the three. And I'm going to be saying a great deal now about the difference between the target accounted net emissions, which suggests that we are no worse now than we were in 1990, and there's been no serious increase apart from a one-off spike in the mid-2000s, and the actual history of net and gross emissions over the same period. So let's just look at the three measures and how they're defined. Gross emissions are New Zealand's total emissions from agriculture, energy, industrial processes and product use and waste that are reported in the inventory. Notice those words reported in the greenhouse gas inventory, and notice that that definition appears in the Climate Change Response Act. It's been put in as a legally binding definition of what we mean by gross emissions. Net emissions, the ones that really matter for the atmosphere, are not mentioned in the Climate Change Response Act 2002. And they are given no space in government policy announcements within New Zealand. They have to be reported to the UNFCCC in the inventory because that's the terms of the treaty require us to report our net emissions to the international authorities. And so net emissions are measured as gross emissions less all the removals of carbon by human activity, which is currently forestry, but carbon capture may come over the horizon in future. But the important thing is that these net emissions do not appear in the Climate Change Response Act, and they have never been mentioned in any of New Zealand's policies on emissions reduction. And that includes last week's emission reduction plan. It has nothing to say about net emissions. Net accounting emissions are defined in Section 4.1 of the Climate Change Response Act as follows. They're the total of gross emissions and emissions from land use change and forestry as reported in the greenhouse gas inventory, less removals, including from land use change and forestry as reported in the greenhouse gas inventory, and offshore mitigation. So you might think that that definition is exactly the same as the second one, of net emissions, but it's not so. In the New Zealand government interpretation of the Act, the words removals including from land use change and forestry as reported in the greenhouse gas inventory do not mean the removals reported in the greenhouse inventory for the purpose of calculating net emissions as we understand them. They're a completely separate set of numbers, calculated under different rules, and they're reported not very clearly in separate sections of the inventory table. And boy, you have to search around for them. In some previous inventories, there was a table 4KP, which contains numbers of how you would go about calculating New Zealand's emissions if you were using the arcane Kyoto Protocol accounting procedures. In this year's inventory, if you go to the inventory tables and look at them, you won't find table 4KP anymore. That's been dumped, basically because people like me were getting onto it and beginning to use it. And so now there's a very large number of individual, very small print row items under table 4A, 4.1, 4.2, and so on. So as Peter will testify, it's extremely difficult to extract the way in which target net emissions are in fact calculated. And here's the judgment that we had in a case we took in 2022. I did affidavits and stuff in this case. Justice Mellon concluded that the Act, which gives this definition, does not hardwire the accounting methodology for tracking progress. It's the subject of advice from the Commission to the Minister. Parliament has determined that it's for the Commission to advise and the Minister to decide on the methodology by which progress against our budget is to be measured. And so this is where target accounting emissions come from. They are net accounting emissions as defined in the Act without the international offset, but they are not calculated in the way that all the international analysts working on this problem calculate them. There's a very particular New Zealand interpretation of the Kyoto rules. So here's what it's all about. The Kyoto Protocol took 1990 as the base year, and it focuses on efforts to reduce emissions from that base. Forests that were already growing before 1990 could not be described as a response to climate change policy because they'd been planted for other reasons. And so because they were not additional actions under the Kyoto Protocol and during the period of the protocol, they were set aside. And New Zealand was allowed, therefore, to start from a zero of forest absorption in 1990 and work forward from there, counting only the forests planted after 1990. And all the pre-1990 forests, which is a big chunk of our forest estate, is simply thrown out, is taken out of the accounts altogether. And I'll show you the consequences in a minute. So we were allowed to start to count forestry absorption starting from the zero base, as if everything that we did after 1990 were additional actions attributable to policy, which is clearly nonsense. Forestry continued to be a commercial activity. The decisions made about planting trees before 1990 are indistinguishable from the decisions made after 1990. This is a complete diplomatic fiction, which was used to create accounts that the New Zealand government has subsequently manipulated and exploited without
since this
mercy.
morning doing stuff.
Sorry? Somebody said something.
I will mute
I
some.
mean, if you want to, you can.
Shush, shush.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear it.
Continue.
Anyway, what this meant was that forestry could do all the work of meeting our Kyoto Protocol promises. And the reason that we've gone that way is it is cheaper to grow trees than it is to cut emissions. And the abatement cost of emissions is reasonably high and rises quite sharply as we push harder to reduce emissions. We can plant trees across great swathes of the New Zealand landscape, and they absorb carbon very cheaply as a byproduct of commercial forestry, in fact. So the Kyoto rules let us talk big and act little, as long as our trees grow and as long as we can expand our forest area. And that's seductive to politicians and obscure to voters. So here are the three measures again. And you can see the gross emissions at the top, the net emissions below, and the target accounted emissions in the middle. Only those withdrawals that I've marked in green are included in the carbon in the target net accounting. And these emissions, sorry, not emissions, these absorptions, this amount of absorption of carbon by forests outlined in the pink is not counted in target net accounting. It's set aside. So although it is reported to in the inventory tables every year to the UNFCCC, all of these absorptions are simply set to zero for the purpose of target accounting, and target accounting takes gross emissions and subtracts just that selected set of absorption by forests. And you can see the consequence of that is that whereas gross and net emissions have risen quite substantially by about a third since 1990, target net emissions have not risen at all. And because we always report our performance in terms of target net emissions, we always look as if we have held back the tide of rising emissions. So let's have a look at the success of international commitments that New Zealand has undertaken under this gross net accounting. We call it gross net accounting because you start from a 1990 number, which has gross emissions, but the carbon absorption is set to zero because it's the base year. So you start gross and then later on you compare it with target net. Here are the three series again. And this is the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. The target that we set for 2008 to 2012, which is here, was that our net emissions, by which we meant target net, would be the same, no higher, as our gross emissions in 1990. So that blue dotted line across the diagram is the target that we declared for the first commitment period. And there's the first commitment period, those 5 years, 2008 to 2012. You can see outlined in green here the total emissions as measured by target account, the total emissions that we committed to supply according to target accounting. And you can see that the target accounting line runs below the target. We hosed home in the first commitment period on an undertaking to keep net emissions in the first commitment period exactly the same as our gross emissions in 1990. Meanwhile, of course, what the atmosphere sees, the actual net emissions had risen quite substantially, but we never reported that in showing that we had complied with our Kyoto CP1 target. So that worked really well. So we move on to Kyoto Period 2. Now, to understand the accounts for Kyoto Period 2, you need to realise that every year the Ministry for the Environment does a new gas inventory. Every year all the numbers are changed. They continually shift up and down. Methodologies are revised. Things are put in and out. So I've left you with the same lines that I showed you before, but I have inserted in orange here the gross emissions that were being recorded at the time when we were demonstrating our compliance with the second commitment period. And here is the target net calculations that were done for the second commitment period, which is from 2013 to 2020. So there's the CP2 period. The target we set ourselves was to be 5% below the 1990 gross figure. The 1990 gross figure, you can see this was the 2016 inventory, and that year the gross figure was shown as quite a bit below what's shown in the current inventory. So that was the base year number, 66, and the target was 63. And you can see here's the target net accounting result, and there is the budget we had set ourselves. And lo and behold, you can see that there's just a little wee overshoot. Unfortunately, back in the first commitment period, New Zealand had engaged in a lot of trading in junk hot air units produced by the Soviet Union and Ukraine. It was a fairly corrupt period, and the New Zealand government used a lot of those junk units to pay off its obligations under the first commitment period. So it came into the second commitment period with an enormous banked stock of units derived from that period of semi-criminal activity in the first commitment period. And so it was easy to cover that little shortfall, and we walked away with our head held high from the second commitment period. And what you'll notice is that the second commitment period, the net emissions that the atmosphere sees continued to be substantially higher than the 1990 net emissions. In other words, we had allowed our net emissions to increase massively during that period, but never had to report that fact anywhere explicitly. So here's the situation for Kyoto 1 and Kyoto 2. So now we can say those first two commitments were so weak as to be meaningless. There was no need to cut gross emissions at all. They sounded impressive. They passed muster under the rule book. And furthermore, the CP2 one wasn't even a binding commitment. We walked away from Kyoto, refused to take a legally binding commitment, and said unilaterally we will organise our own commitment period promise and targets and do our own accounting to show that we met it. But we kept political credibility with the local population, and we got away with it because the other countries who might have criticised it were also acting without good faith. Everybody was gaming the Kyoto Protocol, and only a few international NGOs were really serious about auditing the numbers. And then came Paris. This is 2015. At Paris, every country had to make a nationally determined contribution to meeting a 2 degrees warming target. And so there are two important things about these nationally determined contributions. The first is that they're non-binding. And of course, that immediately lowers the stakes. All the governments were promising to do was to declare a contribution, but not be legally bound to meet it. And they were supposed to show their highest possible ambition. But I don't think any of the signatories of the Paris Agreement came within any distance of showing of embarking with the highest possible ambition on emission reduction. But political credibility requires that you had dramatic sounding targets, while the real politic required minimal actual commitment. And so here's what New Zealand did. We declared that target net emissions in 2030 should be 36% 36% lower than 2005 gross emissions. Now, the choice of 2005 is not random. And then in 2021, the Ardern government, Ardern and James Shaw basically, got some headlines by raising it to a 50% reduction and a total budget of 571 metric tonnes over the 10-year period. So now let's put that into our chart and see what it looks like. At the top here is gross emissions, what I showed you at the beginning. At the bottom here is net emissions, true net emissions. In the middle, the dotted line is target net emissions. And you can see the starting numbers and the finishing numbers up to 2022. The blue dotted line is the level to which we said we would bring target net emissions down by 2030 if we went a 36% target. And then when Ardern raised it to 50%, the orange dotted line shows you what we were committing to bring target net emissions down to by 2030. And if you get the feeling that we were not heading in that direction at all, you'd be absolutely right. And if you think it would require quite a massive effort actually during the 2020s to get down to even the 36% target, you would be right. And if you thought the 50% target really was committing the government to frontal assault on our emissions, you would be right, except that they didn't do it. They turned and ran. So that has got us to where we are today. So here's the nationally determined contribution. Reduce net greenhouse gas emissions to 50% below gross 2005 levels by 2030. Corresponds to 41% when managed using a multi-year emissions budget, starting from New Zealand's 2020 emissions target. And based on New Zealand's most recent greenhouse gas inventory, this provisionally equates to, I can't see the number, but I think it was 571 tonnes over 2030. Now, reading this, 50%, 41%, some number of tonnes, I don't think anybody in the New Zealand media or most of the New Zealand public could understand that. It's deliberately obscure. And it's specified then in terms that are opaque to everybody but the most specialised insiders. And it's ostensibly based on Kyoto Protocol accounting rules. But by using a 2005 base year rather than 1990, it's 1,000 miles away from the Kyoto Protocol. So let's put the NDC in perspective. Here's that chart again with the gross at the top, the true net below, and the target accounted net emissions across here. The NDC starts from, remember, the New Zealand's 2020 target from the second commitment period. So it starts here. There's a total of 571 tonnes of the budget, and the emissions in 2030 are to be 50% below the gross in 2005. So in 2005, the gross, using the latest numbers, was 87 metric tonnes. And the target, therefore, is 43.5 million tonnes in 2030, and that's the 50% target. Now, you can see that choosing a starting year 2005 rather than 1990 means that you have built into your base year 15 years of quite sharp increases in gross emissions after 1990, which was intended, that year was chosen with great care by Tim Grosser and his team to make the target as easy as possible to meet while sounding as dramatic as possible. Nevertheless, as amended by Ardern and James Shaw, you can see that this is a considerably more difficult problem than anything we have tackled in the previous periods. And then let's add a couple of bits to the chart, because you can see here that what I've done is taken the history down to 2022, and then I've put in the 2030 target, and I haven't sort of showed you where things are actually going over that decade. So here is the projected gross emissions that the Ministry for the Environment projected last December. So that's a figure that's 6 months old. And that was assuming that all the policies that were then in place, including basically they were working with the last Labor government's policy still, because although the new government had been throwing things overboard like crazy, the modelers had to work with data they had from the previous couple of years. So that is the gross emissions track on which the last Labor government was considered to have put us, which is, as you can see, not negligible reduction in gross emissions. It includes things like the clean car arrangements to push the light vehicle fleet towards renewables, some pressure on the electricity system to become more renewable, and spending up big taxpayer money on converting New Zealand Steel to electric and pushing Fonterra to electric, and of course, among those assumptions, closing down the Tiwai Point smelter. Then we go down to look at the projected net emissions. In other words, what was the projection last December? This was actually projected last December, but the projections date back to December 2022. They're in our 8th national communication. But that was the Ministry for the Environment's projection of net emissions, which is pretty unhelpful for the 2020s. You can see that what's happening here is that although they thought gross emissions were coming down, they also thought an awful lot of forestry emissions were coming in as the first generation of trees planted after 1990 came to harvest, and previous harvest rotations came through as well. So we had net emissions going that way and target net emissions required to go that way. And so the MFE had to do a projection for target net emissions. What they did was to throw away the net emissions projection and simply make optimistic predictions about a huge amount of extra absorption coming in to get the target net emissions below gross emissions. And you can see that even with that very optimistic projection, there is still a big chunk of emissions over and above what the nationally determined contribution allowed. And how big is the problem? It's about 100 million tonnes of over budget emissions, and that is assuming that the MFE projections work out, and there's no guarantee of that. The Kyoto Protocol rules do allow us to go internationally, and this is going to come important at the very last part of this presentation. The cost of buying in offsets from overseas depends on the price of units. The Treasury reckoned last year it would be between 3 billion and 24 billion. So even the accounting tricks can't rescue us from difficult choices. So what are we going to do? Well, one choice is to massively increase our pace of emission reduction. There's no sign that the government's going to do that. They're going the other way. A second one is to go offshore and find an affordable source of carbon credits that we can pretend, that we can put into our report to cover our excess emissions. Well, the third one is to renege on the Paris Agreement, basically to rewrite our nationally determined contribution. Now, until about a week ago, I was predicting the last of those. I thought New Zealand would walk away. It was clear that if Trump is elected in the United States, he was going to walk away, which meant we had leadership to follow. The Rishi Sunak government was busy walking away from its nationally determined contribution until it lost the last election. So reneging on the Paris agreements was going to be quite a popular move. And of course, reneging on our NDC would save us from having to pay the world any compensation for failing to honour the contribution. So it looked to me as though that was where we were going, and we can do it. None of the commitments are legally binding. The consequences of breaking them are just reputational and political, including, of course, free trade agreements that have clauses that our trading partners can trigger if we walk away from the Paris Agreement. But because it's not a legally binding obligation, the Treasury never put the cost figures as contingent liabilities in the Crown balance sheet. And that's completely in contrast with the first commitment period, when in every year, 2008 to 2012, the Crown accounts include a contingent liability item for the costs of climate change. But we no longer do that. The Treasury just reports the numbers but doesn't put them in the accounts. And here in last year's document is Treasury's explanation. New Zealand can change its nationally determined contribution at any time. The total required volume of offshore mitigation could be different from what under the currently stated NDC if it was to be further updated. The government, in other words, can unilaterally simply restate our nationally determined contribution any time in the next 5 years and declare that we have met our revised contribution. The Climate Change Commission pointed this out earlier this year in reviewing the emissions reduction target. There is a binding obligation to have an NDC, but there's no obligation to meet the NDC because it's non-binding. And changes in the level of our nationally determined contribution target are not a change in our international obligations. And then there's all sorts of people who've been writing about this. And some people thought, and I was one of them, because I didn't read the Zero Carbon Act closely enough. We thought that the minister was bound under the Zero Carbon Act at least to meet his domestic emission budgets, but actually not. Section 5 of the Act says the minister has to set a series of emission budgets. Section 5ZM says no remedy or relief is available for failure to meet the target or an emissions budget. They're not enforceable in a court of law. The only thing you can do is go to a court for a declaration that the budget hasn't been met, and then the minister has to go and make an explanation to Parliament, and at that stage it's all over. So all the thought that we had binding commitments in our legislation turned out to be completely hollow. We don't. So that brings me to last week's emission reduction plan. And I don't know if any of you have read it, but it's an extraordinary document. The coalition government has dumped most of the last government's additional measures, like investing in New Zealand steel. I think they're probably committed to the New Zealand steel one, but they've certainly dumped the clean car rebate scheme, and they've dumped the proposal to bring agriculture into the emissions trading scheme, and they've dumped a whole lot of other sort of bits and pieces that the last government had been embarking on, which were a pretty timid attempt to bring the emissions down and not moving fast enough. The government now plans to achieve enough forestry planting to keep the NZU price $50 from 2035 to 2050. All right, now, this is the point at which you have to suspend all disbelief. And we are now in Alice in Wonderland country. I'll show you why in a little while. So that's the government's plan. The plan is that by 2050, which is still 25 years away, in a world where carbon prices are going to be being driven up all over the place, the New Zealand carbon price can be held at $50 per tonne. And that is, Bernard Hickey called it magical thinking, and I think that's complimentary. But I'll show you why in a minute. Last December, which was only 6 months ago, the Ministry for the Environment was projecting that the New Zealand NZU price would rise to 230 by 2050, and that was a very conservative estimate. So this government's planned trajectory for the carbon price is quite extraordinary. So two things I want to do, therefore. First off, I want to show you how the emission projections have changed, because I've showed you so far numbers which came from the last greenhouse gas inventory, and they came from the projections that the Ministry for the Environment made last year. Now the draft ERP this week has put a new set of projections into play. So I'll just show you how it all fits in, and then I'll turn to the economics. This is going to be difficult because the crucial part of that chart, I think I'm going to have to, there we are, just take it off slideshow. The crucial part of that chart is on the right-hand side. I've added that right-hand section. This is the table that appears in the emissions reduction plan. When they say net emissions, they mean target accounted net. They don't mean net. The projections last year, with all the policies that were in place last year, were that the target accounted net emissions would be 277 million tonnes in the first period, 2020 to 25, 281 in the second period, 26 to 30, and 233 in the third emissions budget, 2031 to 35. The interim baseline projections under the new policies are these: 284, 307, and 270. And if you look at how much increase that is, the first budget, we're almost through it now. There's only a tiny little effect. The second budget, they've added 26 million tonnes to even target net emissions. That's 9.3% up. And for the third budget, 2031 to 35, they've added 37 million tonnes of carbon emissions to the target net figure. That's about a 16% increase, which are reasonably substantial increases. Now, go back to the... So that's the effect of the changed policies in a graph, which is a bit misleading because bloody Excel draws it with not with the zero, but at the bottom of that axis, and I was too lazy to correct it. But here is the projection now, drawn up over year by year over the period from 1990 at the left-hand end out to 2050. We are currently here at 2024, and looking forward, the red line, the green line, is last year's prediction with the policies that were in place last year, bringing target net emissions down to 28 by 2050, and the red line is the new policy where they've pushed the 2050 emissions up to 37.7. So it's gone up 10 million tonnes. And within those three emission budgets, if you look at the numbers, those are those numbers that were in the table before. In the first budget, they've just gone a little bit up. In the second budget, they've gone quite a bit more up. And in the third budget, they've gone quite massively up. So the extent to which the current government's new policies relative to the last government has committed us to increasing our greenhouse gas emissions profile, that's what it looks like. Now, here is a chart of all the three things with history and projections, and it looks pretty complicated. And I won't bore you with too much climbing through the detail of it, because you are going to have copies of the slides available to you. And if you really want to dig, that's what the numbers look like. The black at the top is the gross emissions track with history and projections under the 2023 and 2024 projections. So the high number is the new set of projections with the emissions reduction plan. The low set is what we were heading for last year. The blue here is the target net accounting emissions with the new projections and dotted and the older projections solid. And the red line at the bottom is actual net emissions with the old projections and the new projections. All right. Now, there are two things to notice about this. And the first one is you can see that target net emissions and actual net emissions are meeting here in the late 2020s. And from there on out, they're not entirely dissimilar. And one way of expressing that is to say we're running out of road for cooking the accounts using the gross net target accounting procedure. We will almost certainly change the rules very soon for our accounts and try to account for things in a different way. The second thing to notice is the ambition cooked in to this rate of reduction, even the revised rate of reduction in target net emissions. And you have to ask yourself, how are we going to get this very steep reduction in target net emissions with a carbon price of just $50 a tonne? I mean, that's the economic question in the emissions reduction plan. So let's have a look at the economics, and then I'll stop and we can do questions. Here's the carbon market. Those of you who've done Econ 101 will recognise there's a price up the vertical axis and a quantity along the horizontal. And this line here says, as the price of emitting carbon goes up, people find ways to emit less carbon. It's a demand for emissions, or that's the marginal product of emissions, or it's marginal abatement cost. This curve has a whole lot of different names, but essentially it says pushing up the price of what the polluters have to pay encourages polluters to pollute less. So there is hypothetically New Zealand's demand for carbon emissions. Down here is business as usual. And then suppose you want to cut emissions back from ON back to the smaller amount OM. At what price would you achieve that? The answer is the price PE. That you just read, if you want to get that quantity, you can read the price. In other words, that tells you the carbon tax you have to charge. Or if you want to get a particular quantity by using the price instrument, you set the carbon tax and you can find out what quantity you expect to emerge from that. So all the textbooks will give you this diagram. If the price goes up, emissions go down. That's the idea. Now, if you do it with a carbon tax, you put on the tax. The emissions MN simply are abated, and the market settles at the desired level OM. and the revenue to government is quite a substantial amount. And they can, with a bit of luck, disperse that to the general population as a carbon dividend. The New Zealand government doesn't do that sort of thing. So that's, you just set a price of emitting and you get an economic response. And that's perfectly good economics. The alternative is to set a cap, do cap and trade. And so you set a hard cap, which cannot be breached. You issue only the amount of permits that will enable that amount of emissions to happen. You auction them off and the government gets the yellow amount of revenue, or you give them away, in which case the people who receive them get a windfall profit of the amount of the yellow. New Zealand gives away vast numbers, so there are huge windfall profits accruing to the favoured inside players like Fonterra and Rio Tinto and New Zealand Steel and Carter Holt Harvey and tomato growers up around Auckland and so on. Now, in government propaganda, it's often argued this is the emissions trading scheme, but actually this is not the emissions trading scheme, because the emissions trading scheme has no cap. It has never had a cap, but still doesn't have a cap. The scheme pretends to have a cap, and they talk about quantity restrictions from time to time, but there is no cap on the trading scheme, and the government has now made that explicit, though they haven't admitted it. So the point for a cap and trade to work, it has to be a genuinely enforceable, non-negotiable cap that the politicians can't move around whenever they feel like it, so that people will respond to the quantity constraint that they face, and New Zealand has never done that. In New Zealand, first off, the carbon tax was too hard. Simon Upton tried it in the early 1990s. I was consulting with him in those days, and I watched him try, and the National Cabinet simply threw it out. And we ended up with voluntary negotiated agreements, which didn't produce a single iota of carbon reductions. Helen Clark and Pete Hodgson's tried agriculture in 2003 and were overturned by the agriculture lobby. Tried again in 2005, and Winston Peters blocked it. We ended up in 2008 with emissions trading by default because the government was unable politically to get carbon tax in place. So then let's see what the New Zealand emissions trading scheme did. Here's the demand curve. The first thing is to shrink the market. So the total gross emissions in 2022, remember that was 78 million tonnes. It's hidden on my screen. So here are here's that chart I showed you in the very first slide showing New Zealand's gross emissions in the 2022 year. Agriculture 42, industry 6.1, electricity allocation factor, that's freebies given out to people who use electricity, big business, and the rest 27.4. So what did we do? We set agriculture aside, so that disappeared from the demand curve in the market. We handed out 6.1 of free allocations to industry, and we handed out 2.9 of free allocation to users of electricity. So the demand for to actually get emission units to cover actual emissions is reduced to this demand curve, the solid red one, with a demand even at a zero price of only 27.4 out of our much larger amount of gross emissions. And then we allow forests to be planted and forest absorption to be traded one for one with carbon, all right? Which means that effectively what we did was neither a cap and trade nor a carbon tax. We simply said the cost of planting forests will determine the price of units, and the amount of emissions that we will get will be at the point where the cost of forests intersects with the demand curve for carbon. So the forest owners selling their credits will limit the price, and so long as there's enough forest absorption to flood the market with credits, the price won't go above that cost of planting forests. And the government currently says that's about $50. And the government says we have enough land in New Zealand to plant forests all over it without restraint sufficiently to keep the price down at $50 in the emissions trading scheme. The alternative way of trading is to go offshore and buy world credits. And so the cheapest world price would cap the price at which we can trade overseas credits to cover our emissions. And then, of course, there's a thing called the trigger price, which is written into the legislation, where the minister can have a rush of blood to the head and simply just run the printing press to print in units and chuck them in the market to force the price down. And he did that in 2022. But for the future, the offshore credits and the money printing press are set aside, and forestry is the name of the game. So here is the plan for the emissions reduction plan that was released last week. The plan is that the cost of planting forests at $50 will set the price of carbon across the New Zealand economy for the next 25 years. That requires that we plant every year forests sufficient to supply the demand of polluters to put carbon into the atmosphere at a $50 price of carbon. And so the required amount of planting is the distance between those two lines. This is the planting program that's in the emissions reduction plan. Planting about 28,000 hectares a year over 25 years. So that's 700,000 hectares that we're going to be planting, which is about 2.5% of the total surface area of New Zealand, or a 40% increase in the existing forest area is to be planted between now and 2050, and that is estimated to give us enough forestry absorption to hold the carbon price down to $50. The result is going to be, this is Christina Hood projecting the forestry removals and gross demands, that removals from forestry are going to come flooding onto the market in such numbers that from about 2037 onwards, effectively, we're going to be showing negative target net emissions right through to 2050 because of the sheer volume of forestry absorption that the government is planning to throw into the market. Now, here's the question: where are the prices going in other countries of the world? And these are a series of charts produced by the United States Emission Protection Agency. It came out in November last year. So this is the most recent and most thoroughly scientifically grounded estimate of where the carbon prices are going to go if we seriously try to implement anything within cooey of a 2 degrees Celsius warming. If you look at the 2050 price in the middle of that I've outlined in red, this is the price for carbon dioxide in US dollars per ton, and you can see that the range is from $200 a ton at the left-hand side to $500 or more dollars a ton at the right-hand side for carbon dioxide. And remember, New Zealand is proposing to be having a domestic carbon price of $50 at that point. The Environment Protection Agency estimates the 2050 price on methane at between $2,700 a ton of methane and $6,000 a ton of methane in 2050, at a time when New Zealand is going to be having a price on methane of zero, because we're holding the agricultural sector outside the emissions trading scheme. But as we bring it in, what price methane is going to be charged at will depend very much on that $50 per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent ceiling that the forestry is supposed to put on the market. Here's the cost of nitrous oxide from that EPA study, between $64,000 and $140,000 per ton of nitrous oxide is the carbon price that they're modeling. So the world, if it seriously engages with carbon pricing, is going to a set of internationally ruling prices that is effectively going to leave New Zealand as a very spectacular outlier. Now, the best assumption is that the world is not going to go there. We are almost certainly just going to take climate change on the chin and for another generation continue to fail to use economic instruments to deal with it. But just to restate where we're going here, the coalition government thinks it can hold the price at $50 by afforestation. It meantime thinks it can go offshore and get 100 million units from other countries to cover the national determined contribution, maybe by joint ventures, for example. So it may be that New Zealand sends New Zealand businesses off to Africa to do joint ventures with forestry companies there to absorb carbon and create credits, which New Zealand would then claim to as its own, as part of the joint venture deal, in order to cover its nationally determined contribution. And there is some talk in the emissions reduction plan that suggests we're going to do that. But at the same time, here's the really important thing. We are going to prohibit New Zealand forest owners from doing the same thing. In other words, they will not be allowed to enter into joint ventures with all the other countries to earn carbon credits, which may be worth hundreds of dollars. And when New Zealand producers exporting into the world market pay only a $50 carbon charge in their costs and then go to compete with countries where the producers are facing $200 and $300 a tonne carbon charges, this will be a classic case of dumping, and the current international trade rules will allow those countries simply to put tariffs onto all of our exports to equalise them up to prevent dumping into their markets. So the economics of this is something that I wouldn't have thought my first year economics class would try on, but the coalition government is going at this full steam. And if you watch Simon Watts presenting the emissions reduction plan last week, he seemed firstly totally confident that this was doable, and secondly, I think completely oblivious of the third point on the screen here, that he is going to have a regulation or legislation that prohibits New Zealand forest owners from selling their carbon absorption to anybody else. It has to be totally dedicated to the New Zealand market, which amounts to giving us a very protected bunch of polluters who get away with very cheap pollution and have no incentive to reduce their emissions. And then if they're exporting onto international markets, they are going to face legitimate arguments that we're dumping. So good luck with the emissions reduction plan. This is basically my conclusion. Okay, so that's what I had to say tonight. So over to you guys.
Thank you very much, Geoff. That's really upsetting. You've just blown the whole government's case out of the water. And
I don't think so.
well, for anyone aware of what's going on, I'm really disappointed because it shows me that what I had believed in up until now is nothing but a fraud.
Yeah.
And now as engineers, we have to work out what system we want to see in place and start to work towards that.
Yeah.
So we'll open up for questions.
Right. There's some questions in the chat.
Are there in the chat, anyone?
There's a couple of questions in the chat. I'm just having a look.
There are some. I'll look at the chat soon. Bruce, would you like to ask a question? You're on mute at the moment.
Hi all, and Geoff. At a meeting of a climate activism group some months ago, I explained that this government was going to just tear everything up and throw it away, and was told by a couple of business-friendly people, you've got to wait and see. They're just going to do it a different way. I'd first of all like to thank you very much, Geoff, for showing us, in essence, the different way that they're going to do it, which means not at all and protecting already protected industries. We're heading down an obscenity. I'm really looking forward to getting your slides so I can go back over the stuff in detail. But my question basically is there any sign anywhere else of anyone, including the Green Party, having any sort of feasible alternative to get where we need to go anyway?
Among the political parties, no. The Greens are aspirational, but they don't have enough technical people in the thick of it to write policy for them. But if they're sensible, they will acquire some. I mean, when Russell Norman was running the Greens, he did bring in technical expertise to talk about the feasible options. And if Chloe Swarbrick has her head screwed on, she will similarly call some experts in. The difficulty is that I think only 4 or 5 people outside the government can read the emissions reduction plan and know what's in there. Within the government, the players in the Climate Change Commission and the Ministry for the Environment are very familiar with these numbers, and they create them, and they know exactly what's going on. But outside the outside government, the most notable analyst, the person you can really rely on, I think, is Christina Hood, because she came back to New Zealand from actually being a head honcho in the international climate change bureaucracy, and she does know the score, and her analyses, which unfortunately turn up on one of the odd social media platforms, which and since I don't do much social media, I miss a lot of her stuff. But Christina Hood is always worth watching, and she will be taking these numbers apart on her own account. I know a bit about it because I've been involved in both writing a book 10 years ago, and also because I was called in by the Lawyers for Climate Action to write affidavits for their court case a couple of years ago, which meant I had to slog through the stuff. There's probably half a dozen other people around who know how it's done, and of course there are people like Adolf Sternbergen who did the modelling for them. And Adolf is a good modeler. He just does what he's told. They said, run your model with a $50 carbon price in it, and he ran the model and produced the results and took his fee and moved on. But people like Adolf know how this game is played. So as the material comes into the media, I am anticipating that over the next 6 months, the emissions reduction plan will get a fair amount of airing of what they're up to. And I do notice that the Forest Owners Association has already gone public saying this isn't feasible. We can't plant forests at that rate. What the Forest Owners Association has not yet spotted, so far as I can tell, the fact that they're being ripped off blind by being barred from selling their forestry credits offshore. And I can't believe that the arbitrage opportunity will be ignored by key players in finance and big business who will want to set up the joint ventures to get, thousands of dollars potentially offshore instead of dozens of dollars in New Zealand for forest growth. It's just the regulatory requirements to shut down international trade in New Zealand forest credits, I think, are prohibitive. Which means I think our price will be forced up close to the global price.
Steve, would you like to ask your question?
Yes. Thanks very much, Geoff, for your wisdom, and which I must confess not to have understood every word of it, but I got the gist. But something that concerns me is that my understanding is that the information that's sent to the international accounting is based on MFE's models and accumulation of data, and it's all packaged up and reported and sent out. When I had the opportunity to look at that probably about 10 years ago now, the models that created that most closely resembled a bird's nest and had been tinkered about with by repeated by different people within MFE who joined and worked on it for a couple of years and moved on, and somebody else moved in and moved on, and people were tweaking the models, and it was a real dog's breakfast. What's your view on how our actual reports internationally might be somewhere close to the truth of the matter?
I reckon our inventories are about as good as you can get. You never want to rely on just one inventory. I mean, if you looked at the stuff, you'll know that every year New Zealand publishes a suite of tables. You just go to the MFE website, you can download them. So every year we construct for each year since 1990 a complete table of all the emissions and absorption, and it's hugely detailed. And the law of large numbers is what I usually work with in this sort of a matter. We now have we now have inventories that have been issued and are publicly available starting in 2006, I think it was, under the Kyoto Protocol. So we have a very large number of years, and no 2 years agree with each other. As you say, they're continually adjusting, changing the methodology. Somebody thinks that number should be different. Some new piece of science comes in. So the numbers jiggle. But if you trace them, all the emissions inventories we've published since 2006, plot them all on the same piece of paper together, you find a range within which pretty much as close as you can get to the scientific truth emerges for both gross emissions and net emissions. Once you need to know what the science is and what the definitions are, but the inventory numbers I reckon are pretty good. The bit of the inventory that is most dodgy is the section where they insert numbers that they're going to use to calculate target net emissions. And that's where they're having to work out which land is converted in and out of forestry since 1990. And how we're going to count those forestry emissions for the post-1990 forests. And there's we very carefully, for the first commitment period, we did one set of rules which took the actual year-by-year forestry absorption, because that happened to be, as I showed you, there was a big spike as they deforested the North Island, and then it suddenly stopped in 2008. So year by year, the first commitment period, we ran very low annual emissions. Now, coming into the 2020s, we're much more worried about the fact that all those 1990 forests are coming to harvest, and all of a sudden we were looking at having a great big bulge in our target net emissions. And to deal with that, we suddenly retrospectively decided we would change the rules and average the carbon absorption and emissions over the total life cycle or the harvest cycle of the forest. And so we went to a new system called marginal average budgeting, something like that. MAB it's called. And of course, what that did was shifted a larger number of our target net emissions back into the CP1 and CP2 periods, which we had accounted for originally year by year, and now we've done an averaging, which means we take a large bit of the 2020 emissions and shove them backwards into the historical record where they no longer matter, and that keeps our 2020 target net emissions down. So that sort of manipulation of the accounts is absolutely bog standard in the New Zealand government, and it's been called out publicly by the Gareth Morgan Foundation back in 2016 in a couple of papers, which, you know, nobody's ever refuted, but they've just disappeared. Geoff Simmons, who was one of the two authors on that paper, is now the chief economist at the Commissioner for the Environment's Office, after being the head honcho of the top party in the last elections. And the other author, Paul Young, now works in the Climate Change Commission and is a defender of the target accounting procedures. So there's been no follow-up from the Morgan Foundation. No, that was a long response to a question. I'm just trying to think back. You were really saying how reliable are the numbers, and I'm saying the net and gross emission numbers I reckon are pretty good. I wouldn't go anywhere else for the numbers. Shall we put it that way? They do. They're created under fairly strict accounting rules. They are audited by the UNFCCC Secretariat and expert teams offshore. I would be happy to rely on those. I think our target net accounting figures are unaudited, not generally understood and continually manipulated. So I would regard those as basically junk.
Okay, thanks, Geoff.
And Robert McLaughlin, would you like to ask your question now, please?
Yeah, thank you, Geoff. That was very good. A few years ago, the Commission advised you couldn't rely on unrestrained tree planting because you'd run into trouble after 2050, because you would have to just continually fill up the clear with trees in order to emissions at net zero. So that argument presumably still holds. And doesn't that mean that this ERP2 is not meeting the
Absolutely. It means that we're proposing to blow away all our forestry opportunities before 2050, and what we do after 2050, the current government doesn't care because it's over its planning horizon.
Yeah, so basically we're sort of testing the Carbon Act to see whether it's robust enough and whether we can actually, whether the letter of the law is going to be strong enough.
Lawyers for climate, there will be a case taken, I'm pretty sure about this, pretty quickly. But as I read the Act, the court will say it's all legitimate.
Right.
The minister is entitled to do whatever the minister wants to do. The Commission can advise, but that advice doesn't have to be taken. the Climate Change Commission has no authority. That's only advisory. You also asked about the successive contributions being progressions of ambition.
Oh,
And
yeah.
that equally is just an aspirational statement that has no binding force.
So you're saying we could submit a lower target and then declare that we've met it?
Yes, we can submit a lower target and say this represents progressively increasing ambition on our last one. Because it doesn't say what ambition about, you know, our increasing ambition to avoid any responsibility. Well, no, I don't think we would actually try that. But I mean, the wording is as loose as that. There's a question from somebody about the AR4 and AR5. Oh, yes, the very good one about foresters. If foresters can get hundreds of dollars credit by planting in other countries, why would they bother in planting in New Zealand? Yes, absolutely right. And the other point that I'm making is if New Zealand foresters can actually get an international price on their carbon absorption, why on earth would they bother selling for $50 in New Zealand in the New Zealand Emission Trading Scheme, unless they are essentially faced with legislation and regulation to prevent them from trading offshore. It is worth making the point that New Zealand foresters have been screwed over many times since the emission trading scheme came in. If you go back to the first commitment period, 2008 to 2012, the New Zealand government went off to the IPCC and UNFCCC rather, and collected credits in the form of emission absorption ERUs, emission reduction units, credits for New Zealand forest growth, and the New Zealand government took all those and put them in its own pocket and used them for its own international trading obligations to meet New Zealand's emissions. The New Zealand foresters were denied any pass-through of those ERUs and were issued instead with the New Zealand unit that the New Zealand government had created, which effectively meant that if the Kyoto Protocol had worked as intended and the international price had gone high, the New Zealand foresters would at that time have been deprived of the ability to get the international price on the international value of their carbon sequestration. The issue didn't arise because the carbon price crashed rather than going up. And so people shrugged and moved on. But going through the 2030s and 2040s, it's unlikely that the same thing will happen. And at that stage, I think there will be some outrage. There's another question about AR4 and AR5, which is probably too complicated to start on now. It's just a question of how you calculate how much carbon dioxide is methane equivalent to in terms of its warming potential over a 100-year period in the atmosphere. And the science keeps on evolving, and so the number keeps on changing, and every now and then they update it. And so AR5 means that New Zealand has slightly higher emissions in the inventory than we had under AR4. AR6 will, in due course, replace AR5, and we'll have a new set of numbers.
Lindsay, would you like to carry on, since that was your question?
Yeah, it was. Thanks, Geoff. But just quickly, what I was really asking there, Geoff, was has the AR6 numbers now supplanted AR5, or is AR5 still the current lot of values coming
AR5
through?
is still the state of the art, as I understand it. The
Okay.
IPCC will have a new reporting round in due course, and in that reporting round, they may well review the science and amend their conversion factors. But at this stage, we're still working on AR5. The sixth assessment round has come by, but I don't think it changed the conversion factors, certainly not the ones that New Zealand is using.
Thank you very much. Another related question to do with timber is, can you outline, is it easy to outline why shipping vast quantities of logs offshore isn't sort of some sort of bad move? I mean, it's got a lot of downsides from harvested wood products and freight inefficiencies and things like that. Can you comment on why it's so attractive just to shift huge quantities of unprocessed logs offshore?
Because for the last 100 years, it's been the case that if you own a forest which has nice, straight, marketable trees in it, the export value of that timber, just without incurring any costs except putting it on a train or a truck and throwing it on a ship, has been highly competitive with the return you can get by selling it to a local processor, who in turn has to incur all the costs of sawing it and turning it into finished product. And so right from the 1930s, if you read the annual reports of the Forest Service, it was when Entergren was the head of the Forest Service, he was continually demanding that New Zealand put serious investment into lowering the costs of forestry processing, so that we made better use of our resource, and finding ways to prevent too much of the forest resource from leaking off as exports, just in the form of logs. And once the Forest Service was abolished in 1986, that line of advocacy against exporting raw logs disappeared, and the market took over. And currently, all over the country, sawmills sitting next to perfectly good radiata pine plantations are unable to buy the timber because the price they're able to pay that they can recover on the sale of the product in New Zealand isn't competitive with the freight on board price that the forest owner can get by just shipping it out. That means that an increasing amount of the forestry industry in New Zealand operates only within firms that are vertically integrated, the Carter Holt Harvey and Co., who own the whole thing from the forest all the way through to the final product, manage by internalizing costs and getting synergies and so on to actually supply timber to the New Zealand market, even though strictly speaking they might make as much money or more by just throwing the logs on a ship and sending them away. And the result is that New Zealand, Rob Campbell beautifully describes us as the Saudi Arabia of logs. We do with logs what Saudi Arabia does with oil, basically. They take crude oil out of the ground, don't muck around with it very much, throw it onto big tankers and send it off to Singapore and Japan and China for those guys to do the refining. And we're doing the same thing. Is it good economics? Only if you are a dyed-in-the-wool perfect competition, total free trade, no externalities, no imperfect competition sort of economist, which a lot of them are, in which case you defend the right of the forest owner to go for the highest price regardless of the consequences. If you have any sort of idea of industrial policy to develop the economy, you get seriously worried about the fact that we're chucking away the chance to produce engineered wood products on a large scale. But
thank you for a wonderful answer. Much appreciated.
Sorry, it's a bit long.
No, it was good.
I've got a question. As far as I can see from your figure, if all goes well with the government plan,
no,
can't possibly go well. But if it all goes well, what I'm looking at, I think, in 1990 we had 45 metric tons per year of net emissions. And by 2050, we'll have 38 million metric tons a year of net emissions. What happened to the zero emissions by 2050 idea?
Well, that was never net zero in the sense that you think of it. You're thinking perhaps wait a sec. I'm just trying to get my slides to slide.
So we're going to cut out.
We're going back to here, are we, or are we going into the projections?
Yeah, starts off.
You got to wait. Here we are. That's the one you're looking at from 49, 40. Oh, that only goes up to 2022. Projections.
Then right at the end.
Right at the end here.
There, you see, we're
that's the target net emissions. Yeah. Yep.
That's a reduction of 7 metric tons over 60 years. That's it.
What I'm not
aiming to do.
No, it's a bit more than 7. It's from 70.
Net. I mean, isn't it? I mean,
what? No, the projected. Oh, you mean the change in actual net?
Yeah, what the atmosphere sees. The atmosphere saw 5, and
what the atmosphere sees, they're projecting us to end up at about 20 million tons net. Yeah. But that's always been in the targets. The net zero was for long-lived gases only. Methane has always been assumed to continue to be positive. When the government uses words in a way that you and I might not actually use them, because they're not Anglo-Saxon meanings, they're obscure meanings. You have to recognise that the net zero target for 2050 was never specified to have actual net emissions down to zero. It's always had that 20 or 15 to 10 to 20 of wiggle room. What's happening is that as we get closer to 2050, we're gradually getting less ambitious about what we're going to achieve there. And if we hold actual net emissions down to 20, I will be absolutely rapt. I'll be astounded.
Yeah.
The policy changes required to get that are radical. You know, unless they get away with this forestry thing. I mean, in which case, you can see that there's a little uptick at the bottom end of that chart by accident. I'd love to know whether the guys doing the projections were quietly signalling to us that at this point we've planted every square inch of available land, and from there on out, it's with the ability to drive our net emissions down below gross by planting forests comes to an end, and we are back up towards here, where we're talking about 60 million by 2060, unless we do something about our gross emissions. But it's many parliaments away, many elections away. It's outside politicians' frame of reference, this. Sorry, I was supposed to be sharing that. I don't think I was succeeding in sharing it. It's
No, we could see that.
Hard to know when I'm sharing and when I'm not.
Yeah, it's clear.
Is it? Okay.
Bruce Sanders, would you like to ask your question, please?
Yeah. How unique are we, Geoff, in our mendacity and appalling juggling of figures to suit ourselves and do absolutely nothing about the things that matter? My understanding is that most affluent countries have their own versions of what we're doing, so at least we're part of a pack of people with really, really stupid and dangerous governments.
We're in the middle of the bunch, really. If you look at the climate action tracker charts, I mean, they rank countries on their adequacy of their policies. New Zealand is highly inadequate, with a lot of much more inadequate countries below us, and a lot of more adequate countries above us. The climate action tracker and the German watch numbers very carefully leave the top two positions vacant on the basis that there is no country with adequate policies at this point. But there are a lot of countries that do a terrific amount better than we do. And ironically, I mean, I hate saying this, two countries that I would identify as remarkably less mendacious than we are, and actually much more serious about dealing with the problem, are Britain and Australia. And Australia is particularly interesting to me because it's continually shown as one of the laggards. It's very coal dependent on its electricity generation and very brutally redneck in its international performance and so on. But the Australian government has actually been remarkably serious about getting onto a track towards more renewables. And in terms of their electricity system, which I spend a good deal of time looking at, their rollout of rooftop solar has been absolutely extraordinary, done with 15 years of subsidies and feed-in tariffs and policy encouragement. But if you fly into Melbourne and watch the suburbs down below, if you fly in the morning, as I did last time, all the suburbs are shining with the rooftop solar panels on the houses. You know, finding a house without a rooftop solar on it is quite difficult in the Melbourne suburbs. There are 3-4 million houses in Australia fully set up with solar, and many of them with batteries. In the middle of the day in Australia now, all fossil fuel plants are shut down. The market is totally supplied from mostly rooftop solar plus a bit of grid scale solar and wind. And And Australia is now pushing ahead to another generation of renewables rollout. So they are actually seriously moving towards zero carbon electricity in another 20 years. It is extraordinary given both where they started from and the strength of the mining lobby headed by Gina Reinhardt and well, what's his name? I mean, the Australian government has been extraordinarily courageous in many ways. The British government has actually got quite a stellar record in rolling out wind farms and you know, encouragement for green initiatives on a scale that New Zealand has never contemplated. And it's true that Rishi Sunak was busy throwing overboard some of those policies before he lost power recently, but we're waiting to see where Keir Starmer goes. So both of those countries, I think, are well ahead of us in lack of mendacity. And the Europeans, equally, I mean, the Europeans made the same mistakes that we made with their emissions trading scheme. They overissued, they underestimated the likely prices, they panicked when things got tight and printed more units than they needed to and flooded the market and so on. But the Europeans, to their credit, have had a very strong green track record. And even more so since the Ukraine war, where their incentive to get off gas and oil has been quite radically increased by the fact that it's much more costly to get supply if you don't have Russia pouring their stuff into you. So, you know, all of those countries, I think, rank well ahead of us. And now the other shocking and unpleasant truth is that the Biden administration in the States is actually making spectacular inroads through the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which actually is nothing about reducing inflation. It's inflationary, if anything. But boy, they are spending trillions of dollars on green projects. And it'll all end if Trump wins the election. But I don't know if you've noticed, but the EPA, who did those price projections that I showed you, they've currently been given several, I think hundreds of billions of dollars to spend before September. And they have a tiny little bureaucracy. They've got 30 staff on the job of spending these hundreds of billions of dollars, allocating them to projects across the states. And they've got a September deadline because that is Trump-proof. If so long as it's spent before that point in the financial year, Trump can't claw the money back under the budgetary law. And so, if you know, the next 2 or 3 months, if you watch green projects in the United States, it's going to make Shane Jones's Provincial Growth Fund look like peanuts. This is massive boondoggling is going to be going on. Every pork barrel artist in the country will be on the take. But the outcome, I mean, will be far less efficient than it will be with a properly designed program, but they are putting serious dough into this. And there will be some serious fruits from that dough. There will be honest brokers who get in there, get the money and deliver quite important results. So yeah, we're in the middle of the bunch and there are a lot of people ahead of us.
Thanks very much.
Andy Buchanan, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, Geoff, this has just been fascinating, and for all those of us who do not.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of us left.
Well, so my question is about the forestry stuff, because I'm a tree guy, a woody building person. But just what if the government had its way and there's this huge amount of tree planting? What I'm curious about, are these trees ever going to be cut down? Are they assuming that the trees will be planted and left there?
They don't care. The trees will be planted now. It will be 25 to 30 years before they reach maturity. That's outside the government's planning horizon. Foresters, they are assuming, will register these as carbon forests, which means they will be issued the units as the forests grow. And because they're declared to be carbon forests, implicitly that's a commitment never to harvest them. Having made the commitment never to harvest them, they don't have to prune them or tend them. They just have to stop them from getting infected with beetles or being burned down or blown down. So for the growth cycle of these carbon forests, there is no obligation to do anything except collect carbon credits and sell them on the market. In other words, foresters are supposed to be pocketing their $50. any forester who thinks beyond the 2050 point, and if you're investing in a forest now, you're really thinking about 20, 30 years in the future, because that's how long it takes the trees to grow. And if you're investing in other and not Pinus radiata, you're thinking over a longer horizon. If I was doing that, I would be thinking in the short run, I can play this market for suckers and take my $50. In the long run, I will be landed with a bunch of absolutely useless, very, very sticky, not useful timber pine trees that I could maybe sell to the carry-on mill for pulping, but they'll be very low quality trees because if they haven't been tended. And if I'm serious about where I think this is going, I would forecast that there will be a radical turnaround in policy before 2050. And all of a sudden, the harvest value of my trees might be quite different. So I would, as a precautionary move, put some of my carbon units aside immediately, that is to say, withdrawing them from the market that the government is relying on them being sold into, and put a bit of tending time into my forests, giving them a bit of a prune so that they have an alternative value to being carbon forests, because I'd be taking a bet that the carbon forestry scam won't last. And I don't want to be left holding an unsaleable, useless baby. I'd much rather be holding a forest that potentially could be converted back to harvest. Now, if I do that, remember, I don't release my carbon units into the market, and so the carbon price is not held down to $50, and the whole thing gravitates towards the global price. I mean, the economics of this for any first-year student are nuts.
Okay, well, look, I think we've heard enough there, but I understand exactly what you're saying, because the idea of planting a radiata pine forest and expecting it to live for hundreds of years just makes no sense at all.
No, it only has to live.
Any more questions? One last opportunity. No, thank you very much, Geoff.